Welcome back to Mindful Endeavors. I am the New Age Alchemist, and joining us today is Darian. So, really quick, as always, we're not mental health professionals, and we're just kind of discussing these topics just as a normal people just living out in the world and how we see things, and maybe even how we've experienced things ourselves. And we also encourage we also encourage you to continue the conversations around mental health, and if you do need help around that area, then go ahead and seek it. We also encourage that as well. All right, so Darian, really quick, just give yourself a quick intro. I know we've met like through the fishing community, so that was kind of cool. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So my name's Darian Britton, from Northern California. So met through the fishing community on Instagram. So I, got really pumped when you said that you wanted to start doing some mental health stuff, because that's what, my career is, like, as a mental health professional. But, it's cool because, like, taking the hat off of, like, being the professional world is that, like, mental health plays so much a part of, like, my life, and especially, like, being outdoors. And so, yeah.
All right, cool. So what exactly is like your role in the mental health profession?
So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Mm.
So what that means is I hold a license to be able to do therapy. And so I'm licensed in the state of California. And so what I can do, like, my specialty per se is with kids.
Mm.
And so I work a lot with the county system. And so we do, so we build Medi-Cal, and my target population is moderate to severe. And so I work with kids in the foster care system. So I'm with child welfare, and I work with a lot of those cases mutually. So
Yeah, and one of the topics that we're going to talk about is just kind of like how like the lockdowns because of COVID have affected our tiny people, our kids
yeah,
and everything, and it's just something that's not really talked about a whole lot. And even right now, there's still debate around like opening schools, and we're not talking about the political aspect of it, but we're just going to talk about like the effects that do take place, and we often tend to like overlook. I know personally, like I have a nephew that was barely going into kindergarten, and he was trying to do the whole virtual learning thing, and it was just not really. I didn't see it go very well, like, to be honest. So, but then there's also the fact that he's barely learning how to socialize, so he doesn't really have that those skills yet, and he was barely starting to like open up to like playing with other kids, but now it's kind of going the opposite way because now it's being like shut down. So
yeah.
I mean, like, so do you get kids that have like have issues like that, like with school or socializing, or more or less? Or
Oh,
like,
yeah.
what is that?
Yeah. So not just primarily kids in foster care, but like kids in general. I mean, normal school systems, socialization is kind of like one of the important things that you go to school for, right? So you go there to learn skills to, like, how to communicate, how to, like, ask questions, how to basically everything like we do, like, in how we function as adults is like what we come up with in the school system. And so when you're supposed to, like, do that virtually, and I know that's a whole nother topic too, but like how kids nowadays in this generation of like how you're operating in a virtual format, it takes a toll on our kids because there's just so much weird dynamics, weird different things that you don't get that one-on-one contact with until, like, learning social cues, which is super important, like when you're a person. And our kids miss that virtually. And so I have a lot of teachers that I've worked with who kids just get up from their screens and then just don't come back to class.
Oh wow.
So they just, like, some of my kids who have got some pretty severe ADHD, they, find something else to do, or a parent will walk by and, like, there's, just the teacher there, and we're like, oh, where's my kid? And backyard playing with a dog or something else. So yeah, it's very challenging for a lot of our kids. And then, when you add the whole aspect of, some of our kids are more challenging populations like foster care, or some of the youth are just a disadvantage. It's even more so of a challenge of, like, how do we get these kids connected?
Yeah, because I mean, one of the scariest statistic for me was like how much like child hunger was going up like after schools were locked down, because there was like like quite literally like the only source of like food that they had available, like because they're on that free lunch and that they can
Yeah.
go out there and have a decent meal, or what that's also a different topic. But yeah, and just how like short-sighted we were when we're like just lock everything down, and it's like, well, what about these kids, that use school as like their escape, and in other situations, like, and we didn't see that. Like, I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah. I mean, and then too, just the way a lot of schools are built, especially in Northern California, we have just so many resources built into the school system that they may not necessarily get access to, or it's just the cultural thing of like their parents, of like their parents may not have access to it. So they're getting touched by a lot of different people, metaphorically speaking, but they get all kinds of different things in this, like not just food, but they're getting emotional connection, they're getting social connection, mental health, they're getting physical. So, they're not getting the same physical health. I mean, it's kind of a joke hearing some of these kids of like, I was like, oh, so what do you do for PE? And they're like, oh, we do like this online class where we just kind of like dance along with some of these people. And I'm like, okay. Or like some high school kids, they have like this whole printout of like, oh, we're supposed to do this workout routine. And they're like, yeah, no one even shows up to class half the time. And so we're just like on the honor system saying like, oh yeah, I did my 10 push-ups or my 30 sit-ups. And it's very, very strange.
And that's really weird because I remember, I never really took PE because most of the time I was in sports, and there was one time where I had an issue with like I was scheduled not in the right way, so I ended up taking one semester of PE, and like I remember it was easy to cheat it then, so I would imagine it'd be easier now with being virtual.
Yeah, so. I mean, what growing up for me is like it was very competitive because we had like the whole or in California, like we have the whole like presidential thing, like you have to do these certain state tests or state standards in order to, and then so for me, like the competitive side of me, I was like, oh, I want to beat this score, or beat the school record, or do this and that. And yeah, it's hard because like some of our kids don't get that opportunity to be on site, on campus, to compete with their friends. And I think that's another thing too, is that like virtually our kids compete in different ways, like through video games, but they miss that whole and I feel like competition can be healthy, sometimes like that gets turned down. But I feel like our kids can learn healthy sportsmanship in a on-site format, and it's different like when it starts moving a little virtually.
Yeah, I would agree as well. Like competition can be good. It's like anything else really. Like depending on how like intense you get into it. Like
sure.
Sometimes people can take certain things overboard. Sometimes people think like something as simple as meditation sometimes could be taken, to the extreme. And people often wonder, like, well, how does that happen? Well, it's just, like it really depends on how much it controls, one's personal life and everything. And same thing with competition. You can have an overly competitive person, but if that person isn't necessarily like doesn't have the interaction with other people to kind of like figure out like, okay, what exactly is me being over competitive, then you're never going to really be able to adjust that, right? Like in the future. Yeah. So that's kind of like why like those social interactions are very, very important. And I think in the age where we're kind of like, we're all digital now, and it's like, well, it's a lot easier to like forget that, yeah, just because you're behind a screen doesn't necessarily mean that your actions don't have consequences, or they don't impact anything. Like people might think, like when you're talking about like video games, like people think that sometimes certain trash talk, you might not be taking it too far, but you don't realize who's on the other end of that trash talk. Right. Yeah. So that's kind of why, like, I don't like the fact that it's all virtual now.
Yeah. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. That's like too much of one thing. And so that it's like too much virtual. You're missing out on, like you said, like some of those social cues, learning how to interact with other individuals. And so then you just get too comfortable speaking, or I have some kids who have a hard time, Blackberry words, and knowing when to shut up. Like they just continue on. And so they go in some of these social settings, or like some of their schools are starting to open back slowly. And so they're getting like very limited exposure. So like some schools, like maybe one day a week or twice a week. And so a challenge for some of my youth that I work with is that they have that whole mentality of like the whole virtual aspect of I could say what I want to say without any consequences. And so, but they get met with what I like to call natural consequences. So you're going to say something and someone's not going to like it. And you're like, oh, what are they going to do to me? And so these other people understand that, like, hey, that's, that doesn't fly with me. And so, they'll get a fight, or, they'll start making, personal jabs at, like, it's like, oh, you're just, kid in foster care. Like, you don't have anybody. You're just a little orphan. So, but then, yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, because that's the thing, like, I know it might sound a little bit extreme, but like, it's like one of those things where, like, if you haven't been punched in the face, you don't know like what the consequences of your words are, right? So I mean, yeah, and we're not promoting violence or anything, but it's just one of those things that kind of happen. I mean, I grew up with that. I mean, I learned very quickly that if you punch someone, they're more likely to punch back, and that was me in third grade punching a fourth grader, which is a huge mistake. Yeah, so I got punched back hard, and I got a bruise for days, and my mom was always like, "What happened?" I was like, I fell, like, because I never told anybody, because I was the one that started it. So I was like, it's gonna come back to me. So I think, like, part of that, like, is I mean, I'm not gonna say that it's missing, because again, I'm not trying to promote violence, but those things are like just things in life that kind of like they act like more as like reality checks. To like, hey, you can't just say anything. Like, yeah, you can physically say whatever you want, but
right,
don't expect there not to be consequences.
Yeah, it's definitely a humbling experience, is that when you could start experiencing that, it just like everything I do has a consequence, whether it's positive or negative. It's like everything that happens in our life. And that's such an important lesson for kids, is they just, they don't developmentally, like that's a lesson they have to learn throughout adolescence. I think we all do that. Like we have to know that, but it's so like virtually it distances from our consequences even further, because we don't get to see the other side of what that does. Even for like some of the teachers, not that they're doing anything wrong, but it's more so of that, like, the things that they do also affect our kids. And so the things they say. So I know both sides, our kids equally say stuff, but it's like we as adults and, like, other people in the profession or in other roles, you just have to be careful of, like, things we say to youth, things we say to kids, because how, you could either change their lives dramatically, or, for positive or negative.
Yeah. Some people, like, I always kind of think about it like this way, where it's like some people will react to like a, metaphorically speaking, obviously, I'm not saying like teachers should be beating kids, but
Yeah.
some people react to like a swift kick in the butt. Other people, that will actually break them and send them to the place that we were trying to save them from anyway. And it's really tough, especially for like teachers, because I mean, a lot of times teachers have to put on the hat of like also like a mental health, consultant to a certain degree, because they have to kind of see those things. And like one thing that I definitely learned just from diving down the subject is, it's like sometimes you can't really see like those cues of like somebody struggling or having deterioration of their mental health. Like, it just like that, it just snaps. Just like, it's like a light switch. Like sometimes it just turns on, and you never know if it's too late or not.
And that was one of the hardest things once COVID started, was interacting with my youth, because with the way COVID was, they wanted us to do more social distancing. However, like for me personally, like I took some risks of like having, seeing kids face to face, doing social distancing, whatever, wearing masks, whatever your political thing is. But for me, it's just like I knew my kids on my caseload really needed that in-person touch. For one, you take a child who's highly hyperactive and try to do a session like this, and it's not very doable. Or I have some kids who are have some delays, and so they don't pick up on cues. And so it was so important for me to be able to be there physically, and not just like role model those things, but there's almost like a spiritual connection, like when you're there with someone personally, like in face to face, that there's this touch that you get from someone just being present with them. And so for me, I was like, that was so important, because growing up, I always had I had a mentor in my life that like ultimately led me into the mental health field. But that was so important for me, like moving in this season, is that my kids they needed this thing. And so it really made me think, it challenged me to try this, and it was good, because I'm like, this is kind of outside my comfort zone, doing telehealth for a little bit. And but yeah, it was very, very different and very challenging trying to provide mental health services to kids who really need it in person.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the power of a hug sometimes is very severely underestimated. Like,
Oh yeah.
yeah, like I remember like in high school, just from maybe not even necessarily a girl that I liked, but just a girl that was just really friendly with me, just gave me a hug, and I was like, okay, this kind of made my day, like, it's just some people just need, and some people just need like somebody just to kind of reach out and say, hey, how you doing, and like, and that just translates even to adults sometimes, and
Yeah.
I mean, I can imagine how how the struggle was for you to kind of get somebody to focus on like a virtual like session, because like one of the things that I've keep talking about in the podcast is that our attention spans are like rapidly declining, like they're severely shortening, and it's just a mess.
Well, yeah, and then tying back into like impulse control, because I feel like impulse control and attention kind of go hand in hand. So with the way we do things now is everything's instant gratification.
Mm.
With food, we can go online and order food and it's delivered straight to the door. We download movies. We're missing the whole going to movie theater aspect of it, because everything's like being released online. And so with kids now is like they don't get to learn that delayed gratification, and which I feel like is such an important skill to learn, because I mean everything in life you have to work for. Like the things that are worth having need to be worked for and earned. And so when you can just get them, you don't get that same, I would say that that dopamine of like, oh wow, like I put in all this work, I put all this effort, and here's what the finished product of it, and I get that satisfaction of like, okay, well it makes it easier for me to like gratification in the future, because like I've learned this lesson and it was so fulfilling, it was so rewarding.
Now, yeah, and I was going to transition that into this next question, so you did the job for me. But now the question I have for you is basically like, so we've seen that like things like like woodshop and other things where like hands-on that we used to be taught in schools like have been taken away, like even something as home ec, like something as simple as that, or people think that's might be simple, depending on who you talk to, but you think with those things being removed, do you think that also contributes to like we're talking about like we're not really experiencing the delayed gratification that we normally did, when we younger generations, I mean older generation?
Yeah, so that's such a skill too to learn of it, like, oh, these things take time, but kind of tying another thing into there is like we have like our own it's kind of like our sixth sense. So we have like what's called proprioceptive and vestibular sensory, and so some of that is just some of it's balance, some of it's like pressure, like when you talked about hugs earlier. So you're getting like a lot of these sensory things, and so our kids are ultimately becoming sensory deprived in a way, is because you're missing that tactile stuff. And so, which I feel like a lot of it does go back into like gratification, because when you're doing those type of tasks, it's really fulfilling a different side of us that we don't get virtually. You're not getting those senses, you're not getting those feelings. So it's an experience. So like when you're doing those type of activities, like building, like want to know what the grain of the wood feels like in your hands, the smell of it. You're getting all these type of senses that ultimately, like I feel like that's one of the greatest long-term memory things that we have is smell. And so you go to like grandma's house and you smell like that, sweet potato casserole, and you're like, oh man, I remember when I was 5. I'm like, that was such a good time. It's for me, I had wood shop for my freshman year in high school, and so every time like around that, I could always go back and like I made all these really cool projects. And so for me, and I'm like, man, that was such a great time. And so, but through all that, that process, I learned a lot of skills. I learned of like, I couldn't just make a clock in a day. So we had like different projects. And so we only had so much time. And so, but ultimately when I was finished, I gave my mom a few of these projects and she still holds on to them. And she's like, oh, these are such like cool things to look back on. And like, yeah, you just get a sense of fulfillment that, you can't just get from video games of like, oh, I leveled up, which that feeling lasts like that. You're like, okay, yeah, so what? I have, 50 more levels, and it's a never ending thing. It's like feeling so insatiable of like, oh, I can never feel fulfilled.
Yeah, and even like when you bring up the example of video games, like there's people that are constantly looking for hacks like all the time. Like,
yeah.
You have like a few dedicated gamers that like they grind it out and they figure out like how to do this the quickest way and the fastest way. And that's what you see on YouTube when you're trying to type in like, how do I do this and such or
Yeah.
this, and it's like, this is the quickest way to get to wherever you're trying to do, like in a video game. So, even when we have an opportunity to kind of get the work on our delayed gratification, and how that important that is, like we don't even take advantage of it because we're always looking for the shortcuts,
Sure.
and like I know that me from like I never really experienced woodshop, but because like I think when I started, I mean there was woodshop in middle school when I was in middle school, but I think by the time I got to like 8th grade they took it off. But like I remember like even in kindergarten, like something like we would like get the cement or the clay or whatever, and we put our hand and we would have to wait for it to dry to take it home. Like it's something as simple as that. Like I would show it to my mom, like, hey, like this is what I did, and I had to wait like a couple hours to do it. It's like
Right.
I don't even see that anymore. Like to be honest, I don't know if that's just the schools that I'm around by, or if that's the same across the country. But it's those things the little things that we really need, for that. And I think like learning how to be a little bit more patient, because even like for example like TV, um, I've kind of tracked TV like from the 80s all the way to like now, and it's like, well, you have like in the 80s you have like the theme song that would last like almost the whole entire 2 minutes, 2:30, right? And like now it's like 6 seconds, and you don't even see the credits. Like the credits have to start at the beginning of the show because it's like they don't have time for the credits, so it's just like directed by, and that's it, and like the title of the show.
Or you click the button that says skip intro on like,
Yes.
and you don't even get that, because I'm guilty of that. Of like I don't watch the full like Yellowstone intro. Like I've seen it once, I don't need to see it again. So
yeah, exactly. And I mean like that's kind of why I prefer sometimes Netflix over Hulu, because Netflix has that option. Like, so it's like, oh, this is awesome. I can just skip through like the 15 seconds that for some reason I cannot wait, like just because I'm not patient enough for 15 seconds, but I can cast a line and wait 6 minutes until something bites. I don't know what that what that is, So I think that's kind of like the underlying issue in a lot of things is the fact that because we don't have the patience, and we're not working on that. Like that's why we can't appreciate delayed gratifications and something like when you're building something, or even like welding, like when that takes a lot of time, and but you get something great out of it, and you can you learn all those skills that are still marketable out in the workplace. So like we don't have that anymore.
No, it's super unfortunate. I feel like the way everything's going, it's like what's catered to technology, and well, that's how we have to get kids. I remember when I was a kid, like how they would get to kids for marketing was through commercials, through cartoons. And so it'd be like, oh, I want this, I want that. And then so nowadays everything's delivered through, virtual platforms. And yeah, it's definitely, it's missing. There's definitely things that I really feel like need to change, or just, I don't know. As you get older, it's always like, oh, back in my day, this and this and that. And so I always hear my parents say that. And so like now, you're getting old when you say, oh, back in my day, like,
yeah, but you're even seeing it in technology as well. Like, I remember when I first started working with the SQL Server, like I think right around, I think I was like around the 2005 version, which the 2000 version didn't have like these nice little diagnostic tools that you would be able to query, and like, it gives you all the information. You kind of had to actually derive that yourself through coding. Whereas like now, like with the newest version, it's getting even better now. Like those, there's like a lot of things where it's like you have tables that already are collecting metrics for you. So it's just a matter of like how you want to interpret them and how you want to kind of like manipulate them to get the information that you want. So like things are getting more convenient as we go along, and I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because like
yeah,
it's one of those things where I'm not even forced to like memorize certain things. Like I'm not saying that I'm going to memorize everything that is everything about coding, but like something like, for example, like we have our phones now. We no longer practice memorizing phone numbers anymore.
mm-hmm.
So again, like we're just like, all right, give me your phone number, save it in my phone. All right, boom, there. Like a lot of the people like that I talk to that like are like, well, mostly with my cousins and stuff, they don't know what speed dial is anymore, because it's just like they just go there, like name, that's it. So like, what speed dial? Like they don't know none of that stuff. So it's one of those things where like I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, to be honest. Like I don't know. What do you think?
I think It's funny because I had like, the traditional, I saw a couple of videos like this that are like, make a gesture that you're on the phone, and you see like some of the older school are like this because you actually had to hold the phone. And some of the other kids are like this, had to hold, their little cell phone against their ear. I feel like in a way, some of the short-term memory kind of starts disappearing because we have to start like relying so much on our phones, and we have to like keep coming back to it. I still remember a handful of friends number when I was in junior high, like, because that's, I think the biggest thing that we had was caller ID, and I'm like, oh, that's so cool. And so you would constantly like, you see that number all the time, so you would have to remember of like, if you didn't know your friend's number, you weren't calling anybody because we had dial-up internet, everything was slow, there was or you just went to your buddy's house, or so like it just forced you to interact more with people because you weren't going to call that girl unless you had her number. You weren't going to like hang out with your buddy unless you knew him. You couldn't hang out on the weekend. So nowadays it's, I'm going to go to his Facebook. I'm going to go send him a message that way, and we could talk. I think we don't even spend time together. We'll just spend time like chatting back and forth, or like, oh, that was fun. But I feel like we miss out on so much of our brain power. Is like we're having to use less of it, but we're using it more frequently because we have to keep coming back to this thing. I noticed even myself, I have to, like, when I go in the kitchen, I'm like having to repeat what I'm getting over and over and over. I'm like, I'm getting this. Then I'll get distracted by something else, and I'm like, dang it. But I really feel like that it is so due to like having our phones on us at all times. You're missing out on that whole like paper, like going to the store, creating like a grocery list. I do that now because I don't know. I get so much more satisfaction of like writing stuff down. I feel like that's really what it helps with memory is the actual, I think there's even studies done that shows that like writing things out on paper tends to have long-term memory. So like if you're in class taking notes, things like that. But I don't know, like now that you're typing, now you're having your fingers do something totally different. You start using different brain systems, but you're not using the same type of memory that you would be like when you're writing things out.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I don't like, I see the convenience as something that can definitely help us out. But I mean, like when you look at like sometimes like parents, like they give their tab, like the whatever device to their kids at a very young age now, and they're seeing that they just have to press this button and I get this, and it goes, and I think maybe that kind of contributes to like the why we're shortening our attention span, because it's different from like reading a book, like having to go through all these things where it's like you can just like click this and then the screen pops up and you already know what you're doing and you already have like something that you want to do, like for example watch a video on YouTube, whereas like you have to research, and like before, I guess we want to call them the olden days, where you have to go into a library and actually check out books on a certain topic, and whereas like now, how do I do this? Boom, like type in whatever you're looking for and it's right there.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then the other thing too is that like since we're spending so much time there, we're getting a lot of blue light, so it's like affecting so much of our brain that now they're inventing like these blue light glasses and all these different things to help interact more with technology. And like you said, it is good, but then you're like, okay, well, we're also giving something else up by having to do that.
Yeah.
There's also been studies done too about the quality of sleep we're getting. And so like we all know how like super important our sleep is. It affects our mood, it affects our hormones, it affects everything. And so when we're constantly having blue light in our lives, I forget what type of wave it is that it puts out or emits, but it doesn't allow us to go into REM sleep as easily or often. And so when you're not getting that REM sleep, it's preventing a lot of different hormones to catch up. Your stress levels tend to go up. Your cortisol is usually higher, which means like more weight gain for a lot of, especially kids who are maybe not necessarily eating the best foods. And so like, we got a whole obesity thing that factors into it. So all kinds of different stuff. And it's funny. Like a lot of it stems down to like technology. And I remember like, I know this is kind of going around, is that people are like, oh, kids don't get bored enough. now because they have so much instant gratification with technology. And so the cool thing about boredom is it creates creativity. So I'm bored. What am I going to do? I'm going to go in the backyard and I'm going to start using my imagination. I'm going to start building things. I'm going to start doing stuff to keep myself entertained. So when you're bored, it's creating it. It's a sense of like creation. It's just like, well, what am I going to do to fulfill this time? And then you start daydreaming. You start having ideas. You start planning of like, oh, you start staring at stuff that you would never like look at and picture and saying like, oh man, I would really love to do this when I get older. But when your face is stuffed in the screen, you're being told what to think. You're told what to dream about, told what to do, and you're missing that whole. What do I want? Like, what are my views? What are the things that I want to do with my time? And so, I feel like that's such an important thing. Is like, when I tell parents, they're like, oh, what do I do? Like, there's all this free time. I'm like, have it. Let them be bored. Don't give them their phone. Don't give them the computer. Like, turn off the TV. I mean, it's hard. Like, we have a 2-year-old, and so there's a big section of the day that my wife's like, TV's off. We're just gonna listen to music. We're gonna like do stuff. And so, I mean, like my daughter's got all these toys, and so half the time when she's watching Moana or whatever, she's just sitting there. She's not even playing with her toys. Her toys are everywhere. But like when it's funny, like when I turn that off and I just see the way she interacts is so incredible, because even at a 2-year-old brain, they have such vivid imaginations and they can start doing stuff. And it's just like something we're born with. It's like innate to us. It's like we can just be creative. That's how, I don't know, that's how we were functioned to be.
Well, that's very interesting, because I actually did not think of boredom as that, as a way of being kind of given as a canvas for creativity. Because like I was very hyperactive as a kid, but I think really what it came down to is just that I didn't really have anything to really focus on like consistently. I mean, yeah, there were video games and everything, but I would like beat them really quick, and then it's like, all right, what do I do now? And it was just like kind of like all over the place. But yeah, that's very interesting that, because I think I never looked at it in that way. Like, that boredom would create kind of like yields creativity. Yeah, it's very interesting, because yeah, I mean, I'm kind of blown away by that, because I never put it into perspective that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just mean that it's just like, it's a skill that like so many times kids are like, oh, I'm bored. But ultimately, like, kids are nowadays, it's hard if like, so if we were to have bored kids and then deprive them of, the TV and things like that, there's also power struggles and things that happen, because it's like, they're so used to getting this level of technology. And so I feel like there needs to be a balance. I really feel like it's so important for our kids to have balanced, even not even just kids, like even us nowadays, is that like, we're just so glued to, our phones, glued to everything, that I know like in my free time, I'm looking up fishing stuff of like, oh, this and that. And my daughter's like, hey, let's go play. And so I'm like, oh, just a second. And then a second turns to half hour, and like on one of the websites looking at tackle stuff. And so it's, yeah, it's sometimes it's so liberating when you just put like stuff down, and just like some of the most peaceful times I feel is like I go sit on my back porch, and like we started working on our yard. And so we going back to earlier, some of the instant that gratification is we put so much time and effort to make our yard the way we want it to look. And so, or even just, maintaining the grass, making sure like all the plants and foliage, everything's getting the water it needs. And you can just sit back and like look at that and just like, oh my gosh, it's so peaceful out here. Like I feel good. I don't need anything. I don't need my phone. I can just sit and just enjoy, the birds, or like just, enjoying like, hey, I did this. This is cool. And just watching scenery. Or
yeah, because one of the things that I did see during the lockdowns out here, I mean, I'm out here in Texas, so they were a little bit more lenient than they were in California. But the funny thing that I saw, and it was kind of a good thing, is I saw people like take their families out for a picnic and just teach them how to play with a ball or whatever. And I was just like, that's very creative that they took that time that, well, they can't really go out or anything, but for some reason, like, I don't know, it's like they were told not to go out, but then that just kind of made them go out there. But I'm like, well, okay, that's great, because we do need that. We do need that interaction with the outdoors, or just out and playing in fresh air, and we do need all that. I mean, vitamin D, like we're seeing like studies about like vitamin D and how crucial it is, not just to resist how how bad you would get a COVID infection, but just in terms of other health issues as well. And yeah, I mean, I think I do see some parents that like they do like try to go out and play with their kids. I mean, when they have time, and then I see some parents that I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to insult anybody, but I've seen some parents that just kind of like go straight to the phone.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where if you don't take the time to kind of like let them know what the impact is of what you're giving them, I feel like that might also play in a factor as to how they develop later on.
Yeah. So I mean, it's hard to say because our generation moving forward of like whatever the Gen Z or what the new generation or Generation Alpha, but it's hard to look at it because of how quickly technology is evolving and how quickly things we're advancing. And so I feel like the relational aspect and the attachment between child and parent is super important. And I'm noticing that among kids. So there's some studies I was reading about like what the outcomes for, just a single parent without having a father figure and how likely they are to, commit crimes in the future, have lower test scores, end up unemployed or all these different factors. And so that's kind of its own thing. But I feel like when you're giving the technology over that connection is like you're missing on a lot of things. And one of the biggest things I've noticed is that like that relational connection is like we have a natural hormone in us called oxytocin, and that's like what they call the love hormone. And so when you get more of that connection, when you get more of that thing, it affects so many other hormones in your body. Is like you start feeling you feel happier. I think like as kids too, like when they get a cut or something like that, they're like, oh, here, kiss it. When they're getting that physical touch and they're like, oh, it feels better. Sometimes it does because you're getting that touch and that surge of oxytocin. And your brain's like, oh my gosh, that was so nice. I feel so happy now. And so when you're first giving that stuff, like your first option of like, here's this, kids get the message of that. Whether they want the tablet or not, like whether they say they do, I feel like we are relational beings. Like we need that relationship. And so it's missing out on that. And so I feel like we're going to become more relationally stupid, I guess, we're just not going to know how to connect with each other. We're not going to know like, of course there's, mental health people, all the other people who are like, hey, this is important. Yes, like technology is here and there's really nothing we can do about it other than balancing it out. And so I feel like until we can learn of like how to balance it out, if like we're really never going to learn the lessons. And that's with anything. Like for a long time, I was like, we had a hard time balancing work with free time. And so like getting so obsessed with like, oh, I have to work. I have to, I got to pay this bill off. I have to do this thing. But then it's like you miss out on your family time. And so I feel like just balance is an important thing across everything, not just technology, but like even balance among like having too much free time, of like too much playtime of like, hey, this was fun. I feel rested. Now I need to go back out and start, doing something. I need to create something. I need to like get to working on like myself or building my career or doing something like that. But I just feel like balance across the board is super integral into like our kids' development.
Yeah, and then those what you were talking about, like those senses that we're not really experiencing when we're having like interactions with physically, and instead we're just kind of interacting behind the screen. I think that kind of translates a little bit more to online bullying and how like brutal it can really be, because again, we don't understand what it's like to be in front of a person and saying those things and seeing the reaction or seeing the like how it affects people, or even like what the damage that you're doing, like I think that translates into like that. I think what we're just talking about, like the fact that we're not getting like those extra senses, like we're not experiencing those, like it's easier for us to like online bully, like, or say a comment and it's like, oh, well, it's just this, like, who cares? And it's like, no, like, like you gotta really like be mindful of what you say to somebody.
Yeah. I noticed that too, of what, like, so much, like, even with texting, is that, like, we get so, I've noticed I have, like, some stronger reactions. Like, I get more stronger reactions from reading text messages than I have by someone saying something to me. And it's so funny because there's so much left to interpretation of, like, like, sometimes, like, on virtual stuff, like, yeah, you can hear someone's tone and things like that. But, like, when people are typing, and I'm not saying this, like, specifically, like, to bullying, but I'm just like, the tone gets misrepresented a lot. And so just knowing how someone's coming across, even if they aren't, but even more so of, like, with bullying. So then it puts that much pressure back onto it. So, like, when someone is being bullied and that is the tone, it just hits so much harder for kids and just for everyone else. And the amount of kids who are experiencing mental health crises or end up going to hospital, let's be put on, like, on the suicide watch, has, like, increased substantially because of cyberbullying. And a lot of the parents, a lot of older adults don't really understand, like, how these kids are being impacted by it, and they're like, oh, just need to develop thick skin. But I'm like, well, this is their culture. Like, this is interacting. They need to know how to interact on virtual platforms, because this is, like, going to be their life moving forward. So they're going to need to know how to do this. And so, but it's also a skill of learning a sense of humility of, like, I guess the whole point of, like, what we're saying is that, like, knowing of, like, you can't just say whatever you want to say and expect. I mean, there was a case where that girl got arrested for, like, manslaughter or for murder because, like, she convinced someone to go kill themselves, and they ended up killing themselves. And so, and then they're like, oh, I just, they didn't realize it, like, how, yeah, scary, or like, your words have a lot of impact.
Yeah, and, like, circling back to what we're talking about, like, like, what we're missing with the face-to-face interaction, like, when a lot of people, like, when they text, they sometimes text sarcastically, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Somebody knows that a person is sarcastic, but when you're put in a situation where you're just not having a good mental health day, or just you're very vulnerable, and somebody is sarcastic to you in a way to try to cheer you up, but you take it seriously because,
Yeah.
again, you don't have that facial reaction to be like, oh, well, they're like, the body language is not there, like, to give you, like, the hints, like, oh, well, that person's being sarcastic. And it's like, you just read it in text, you think it's very literal because you
Right.
can't fit sarcasm in there. So yeah. And go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, yeah, that's super tough. I mean, yeah. I mean, everyone's like, for me personally, like that's become its own type of sense of humor. It's just sarcasm, and it's so when you put it in literal form, it can be a disaster for these kids.
Yeah, and I've had situations with, like, just misspelling and autocorrect sending out the wrong message. So I mean, like, what is it? Virtual communication is not the best when you're talking about, like, heavy topics. Like, it's like, sure, like, hey, do you want to meet me, like, for lunch? Okay, that's that kind of stuff is fine. But, like, when you're trying to, like, really, like, pour your heart out to somebody, I think it's best to really just meet them face to face and just talk about something.
I have parents sometimes, some of my kids will try to text me stuff, and they'll send me these long, like, text messages, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, that must have took you forever to type it out. And then sometimes they get pissed off at me because I'm just like, sounds like this is very important. Like, we should have a meeting to talk about this. And they're wanting, like, like, instant feedback. They were like, well, what should I do? What should I do this? And then they're like, well, it's not going to work over just sending you a text message. I'm like, let's have a conversation. And some of our kids are like, they want that, almost, they just think of, like, oh, I can text my therapist, and I want to, like, get, like, text message therapy. And I know there's some apps and things like that out there, but I'm like, but it's you're missing this whole dynamic of what this should look like. Is like, you get that instant feedback, but when you're relying on that, like, constant of, like, oh, I'm just going to get quick texts, which I feel like those are super important, of getting, like, these encouragement text messages, these little things like that. But, like, yeah, like you were saying, like, when it's these deep, meaningful conversations, or, like, these crucial conversations that need to happen, like, we can have this in person.
Yeah, and like even like high school kids that have like, I mean, nowadays I think middle school children are having phones now too, and you know, a lot of them don't necessarily talk on the phone anymore. They mostly just text when they're trying to communicate, and even that goes into like high school, college, and to some
Mhm.
degree, some adults. Like they don't call anybody. Like before, when I had my first cell phone, even though we had texting, I mean, I think because texting plans got a lot cheaper. Because I remember like oh, I only have 500 texts in a month, so it would be like okay, I would reserve those texts for my girlfriend, and after that, I would have to start calling people, like you know, and that's how it was. Where now it's like unlimited texting comes with default with almost anything now. I mean, probably I'm over exaggerating, but like like kids don't text, right? So a lot of times too, like when going back to wanting instant gratification, people don't realize that a text message was initially intended to like, all right, well, here's a quick message, respond when you get a chance.
Right.
And sometimes people want, well, why aren't you responding to me within like 2 minutes?
Yeah.
It's like, well, I was in the shower, like my phone was in the other room, like, well, you know, I'm sorry, like, you know, and things like that. Because I mean, people just get a little angry at each other because of that, you know, and things like that. Like people don't think that can affect you how mentally stable you are, but they do.
Mhm. And I mean, and so much can be communicated over a phone call of like, say all this of like, hey, by the way, I'm gonna jump in the shower. Okay, bye. And then it's different versus when you're texting, you're like, oh, here's all the stuff I have to type out, and it's just like it's you know, it's like I said, it's short and sweet, and so yeah, and then they just start reading into it. They're like, well, you didn't care about me because it took you 23 minutes to respond back to me, and I saw you left me on red, and so that's like its own little thing of like, oh, it's on red. So I've turned that whole feature off, and I'm like, screw that. Like, I don't want people like misreading anything. I just, you know, I don't care about them. But
Yeah,
it's
because
like,
sometimes I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just saying sometimes you just really all you really have time for is a quick look and then just you know oh I'll respond later because like I'm driving or something and you know like people get mad at that and we've all seen like what happens when you text and drive so
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
yeah because and one thing too like I don't know what it is so I tried calling somebody that mostly just texts to communicate and when I tried calling her she was like so like tripped out like if it was something like new like or like you know to her like oh why'd you call me I'm like well because I just needed to tell you this you know quickly and I couldn't just text it all out well you can just text me in parts I'm like what's wrong with like talking on the phone like why is it so like alien to you like you know it's like you know
that's so unfortunate. Yeah, I like, yeah, when you text, you just don't get the same message across. And I feel like people just get so comfortable with not talking to people. And I know for me personally, like COVID has been, yeah, it's almost like I don't want to get, you know, obviously trying to get some political stuff, but it's just like relationally, it's just like it makes you like, oh, I don't want to go to the store because I don't want to be around people. So just start making people more like introverted and missing out on that, like, oh man, but it's so cool. Like, oh, I really get to talk to this person. So like, I mean, like for this, like, you know, our interactions have mostly been like virtually. And so it's just been so cool to be like, to be able to talk to you face to face and like, you start picking up aspects of like the personality of like, oh, this is so cool. Like, and getting to know this person more like, and yeah, especially like in relationships too, of like when you're dating, you're not getting to know somebody because like you're constantly texting them and you start having this idea of what this person's like. And then when you meet them, God forbid that, you're disappointed because you're like, oh, well, you're not as nice to me in person as you are. Or like the opposite of that, like, oh, you're actually a lot nicer in person than you are when you're texting me. Because like you said, like sometimes you just have to get the quick stuff out. And yeah, so many misconceptions happen through texting.
yeah because even like the emoji sometimes can be taken the wrong way or you know sometimes like you people use emojis and to try to like make it seem more like I guess you can say like this way like more palatable for somebody
Yeah.
but then they get the wrong idea and it's like oh now this person's flirting with me and then you meet in person and it's like no like you took the wrong message I was just being polite you know just being nice and just trying to get to know you or just trying to you know interact with you and such and it's just really like gives off mixed signals and I think that's another problem especially imagine like we're talking about these things right now imagine how like people like in high school when they're still learning how to like date and you know hang out with the opposite sex and stuff and imagine how they're taking it
Yeah, they're not prepared emotionally for all the stuff that they're doing. Um, yeah, I feel like that was such a cool thing. Like even notes, like I remember that was like my texting when I was in junior high, is that like we would write notes to each other, or I would have a when we talk about like sending like these big paragraphs through text messages. I remember getting letters from my girlfriends in seventh grade, and they would be like 3 pages, and I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta. But that was like you got to know someone like so differently through that aspect, and then I feel like that was such a cool thing. And then like like I said, going back to like the whole pen on paper aspect of that sensory feeling of like writing that stuff out. And so, but yeah, like the emojis, like obviously when you're writing on paper, you can't write emojis. So you have to be very specific on the things that you say, the things that you mean. And so now, now like with emojis, everything means something else. Of like, all the vegetables mean something, and it's just like you got actually send something that someone's like, oh, what does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, dude. I remember like there's a joke like somewhere. I don't know if it was a kid show that I was watching with my nephew or something. Where it's like, look, I got a text, but on paper. And it's like, wait, no, that's not a text on paper. That's a letter that you got. Like, it's like or like people drawing emojis on paper because they don't know how to actually write something. So it's like they just draw happy face, pizza, or whatever, and it's like, and then you see the person that's, I mean, obviously it's on a show, so it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know how they, like, oh, this person just did this, and they just met somebody. I'm like, how the hell do you get that from 4 images that were drawn on paper? Like,
That's pretty insightful. That's super cool though. That they're trying. They're using their imagination, their culture to make sense out of stuff. I feel like that even just journaling, I feel like it's such a very therapeutic skill that like I teach a lot of my kids to do. And I'm like, even if you don't know what you want to say, just start writing. And I'm like, I give full permission to use whatever colorful language you want to use in it. Just write, and don't like. I'll tell them, I try to give them like sometimes homework of like, oh, you need to write for 10 minutes straight, and they're like, that's forever. And like, yeah, it is. But I'm like, you're gonna be amazed what starts coming out when you start writing stuff out.
Yeah, like, I think that's a good journal. Journaling as a like, I don't know what you would call it, but like as a mental health decompression device. I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's intervention. It can be used for a whole different things. I mean, sometimes processing, sometimes it's recognizing emotions, sometimes it's attention, because it's obviously it takes a lot of attention to write something, and it's so different too. Like when you type something out, of like trying to find the keys, and when you're writing something, your keys are right here. It's just right here. You just start going, and so I feel like a lot of amazing things happens from writing. And like me personally, I feel like that I have to remind myself of like, it's important to journal. Like, even if I feel of like, I have a spouse or someone to process how I feel. Sometimes like just like putting it on paper and even just curling up and throwing it away has such a profound impact on us, is that we just get to show like our words are important. Who I am as a person is important. And so when you write stuff out, it like you're showing that, okay, this is who I am. This is like projected on a piece of paper, versus like when you type it out on the screen, it doesn't have that personal connection, doesn't have like a sense of who you are get put onto there. And so, yeah.
Yeah, because somebody told me a long time ago, and I just right now when you're talking about that, like it just reminded me of that. A long time ago, I mean, I was a lot more immature back then. So naturally, when they told me like, oh, you should write something down, put it away, read it in a week or two, see if you're still feeling the same. And I laughed at that because I was like, no, that's so dumb. But like now I'm seeing like there should be some value into that. Like, because like it just really kind of like I've done that before where I've had a really stressful day with my family and I kind of just wrote it down, writ how it went down from my perspective, wrote that down and just put it away. And then 2 weeks later, when I'm having fun with my family, I open it and I'm like, when I look at where I was back then to where, and this is just like in the span of like a few weeks, like where I was back then, angry, upset, to where I'm at now, having fun with my family, we're like enjoying a barbecue. It's like, why did I allow myself to feel that way? It makes it seem a lot more insignificant. So I think maybe that's something that we could possibly potentially do, like just as somebody just kind of like as an exercise, because it's kind of like I think it's like important message in life. Like if we don't use it, if we don't exercise something like a muscle, brain, we lose it. I think that's the same thing with our emotions. Like if we don't know how to process that, we don't exercise the way we process that, we come across something and then we don't necessarily know how to process it. So it just affects us more than it really should.
Yeah, and then it gets stuffed down. So then you're caking all these different emotions layer upon layer, and then forgetting what the root emotion is. Because a lot of times, like our frustrations, anger, that's not like a root emotion. It's just like, well, why are you really angry? And so you're not even getting that sense of that, like, well, I don't really feel angry. I feel lonely. I feel this, because you're just getting what's on the surface. So like when you're writing stuff out, you're getting thoughts popped up in your head, and so you're like, oh, well, this and this, and you may not even stay on topic with what you're initially thinking about, but then ultimately you're processing your subconscious, things start coming out differently, and you start learning. I don't know, I feel like you start learning more about yourself than you would any other ways. And so it's a sense of like just reconnection with like who you are as a person. And I feel like the more we could start doing things like that, I feel like we're going to have more emotional intelligence. We're going to be able to recognize like our emotions. We're going to be able to like look at things and say like, or even just have more patience of saying like, oh, I'm able to identify how I'm feeling quicker. And if I could do that, I could, tone back of just like me being volatile with someone, or just like being impatient, or just blurting out at my kids or my wife or whoever. And so, and then the other thing too is that it creates empathy. And so you start learning more about yourself, and the more you start learning about how you feel, you start creating more patience with other people. Of like, oh, okay, well, even though they snapped at me, she's probably having a crappy day. There's probably this other stuff going on with her. So it comes full circle. It's like the more we understand ourselves, the more we understand other people, and then just like the chain keeps going. So if someone else is understood, they can start understanding themselves. And so it's this chain reaction. And that's why I feel like therapy is so important, is because you get to understand someone else. You get to put yourself in their shoes. And once that happens, I don't know, you start feeling loved, and you start, oh, okay, well, I'm cared for, I'm appreciated, and what I do in this life matters.
Yeah, I think even though we didn't necessarily explicitly say this, but I think what it comes down to is empathy and patience. Like honestly, like
Yeah.
because that's all we're talking. What we've been talking about, like just we got to be patient in how we process things. Like the simple thing is like writing a letter and waiting 2 weeks to read it. Like that requires patience. Like I think it all comes down to full circle with like when it comes to like patience and empathy. And I think, and I guess because we're almost approaching the 1 hour mark, we can close with this. But like a lot of things, like when we get along with other people, a lot of times we can't really be empathetic with them because we don't have the patience to really take time to understand them. So it's easy to go based off of one label, like a certain label, like this person is this. Well, have you really talked to that person to see if like what you're judging them based on that label? Like no. Well, it takes time to really get to know somebody, like
right.
And that requires patience and empathy, like especially with like when you look at like kids that might seem a little, like people might think, oh, this person's a little weird. Well, how is it that that person's a little weird? Like you have to take the time to really get to know them, and then if you see where they come from, then you can be more empathetic as to why they're quote unquote weird.
Yeah, absolutely. We just need more of that, more time, more understanding, more patience and empathy.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm pretty bummed out that we didn't get to talk about fishing, but we can always save that for another episode. You're always welcome to come back on. But any last closing remarks that you might have? Anything that you want, like final thoughts you want to like convey or anything?
Yeah. So I ultimately what I feel like, just understanding what kids are going through, but just I think what it comes down to is like really just make sure that you're just taking care of yourself. I think just having some kindness for yourself. Just do things you enjoy, do things you love, take a little break from technology and see what else is out there, be bored, learn that boredom's okay. Boredom can create some creativity, and yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, because I'm just gonna piggyback of what you're saying and what we said in the episode, and just say that, take the time to get to know yourself, and nobody will know you better than you. So it's definitely worth taking time to get to know yourself. And yeah, so I mean, this is made for a great discussion. And yeah, I mean, next time we'll definitely talk about fishing and such. But because I know we had scheduled to like try to talk about fishing, but we just kind of went off of the first topic. So I mean, it went out really great. So I'm really happy with it.
Yeah, me too.
But yeah, all right. So we're gonna pause the recording, but just stay on really quick, just so I can get your thoughts on this. But really quick, if you want people to find you on social media, where can they find you, or it's up to you if you want to share that.
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. That's kind of like where I spend most of my time. So I need to change my my handle or get another one, but it's my name, Darian, and then 333. So you can find me on there if you want to follow me. I'm doing a lot of fishing stuff. I'm going to try to start doing some more mental health stuff on there as well. Just inspirational things that I'm finding out. So
yeah, definitely, because we definitely have to talk about the outdoors, because that definitely can help in decompression and such. So all right, well, that's it for this episode, and I hope you guys all enjoyed listening and watching, if you guys are watching on YouTube. So we will come back for another episode pretty soon. Talk to you guys soon.